Boom. Hey, everybody. Welcome to we always start welcome to the stream, Dr. Friedman. We start incredibly jarringly. It's
No.
kind of,
Yes.
sneak attack is kind of our brand. Welcome to another episode of Guest Quest, the TTRPG community interview podcast brought to you, or stream brought to you by the Gimme the Loot podcast, the Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition actual play podcast that will not be afraid to constantly ask its guests this week to just dumb it down just a little for us. Because joining us this week is Dr. Emily Friedman. That's right. I said doctor. I'm going to lean into that because it's cool. Dr. Emily C. Friedman is an associate professor of English at Auburn University, where she brings her deep love of the 18th century fan studies and textual technologies to her love of games of all kinds, including her Dungeons and Dragons campaign set up in the 18th century. She's the author of multiple book chapters and essays on actual plays as a new genre, is the co-founder of CritRoleBib, the first crowdsourced bibliography for academic work on Critical Role and other actual plays. She's also the editor of an upcoming cluster of Post45 Contemporaries on Beyond the Dungeon, Tabletop RPGs, actual play, and very long form storytelling. Now, I did it.
Hey!
I met Dr. Friedman. It feels like probably a little bit over a year ago when she was very gracious enough to participate in a actual play for Jasper's Game Day, which is a fantastic organization. She was a delight to play with. Thank you so much, Dr. Friedman, for jumping on the stream for us this evening.
Thanks for having me. It's always fun. I think that is my first and probably last kind of live streamed game, at least for the foreseeable future, because I'm not that kind of dork. I study those kinds of dorks in the wild.
Well, you were delightful. If I remember correctly, you had made the very brave and bold choice to let your students pick the magical item that you would bring to the table, and ended up with a cloak of billowing, an extremely Todd the Tiefling magical item, which you leaned into quite well. Joining us this week, and two individuals who did a surprising amount of homework for this stream, which I have never been more proud for. Guys, say hello.
Oh no.
I'm Harlan. I play Todd the Tiefling on the Give Me the Loot podcast. And when I saw a doctor in front of it, I was like, I guess I should do my research. And then I was just like, whoa, wait a minute. I would need about another month to really get a hold of this. But yeah, thanks for coming on.
And I'm Jamie, and I play Eldrin on the Give Me the Loot podcast. And I just sit here and make stupid jokes and play D&D.
I'm not sure which part you're selling yourself short on and which part you're overestimating there, but we're going to let that
50-50.
Yeah. in the feed. So to keep in mind, and again, when we first really talked about you having on, I sent the guys your information, guys. This a couple of months to prep for this one, because this is a little bit more complicated probably than watching G4 TV, and then sent them your article. Your most recent article came out on
Valentine's Day, basically.
On Valentine's Day, on the Rambling, and was a pretty good overview and I think discussion of a moment in Critical Role and actual plays as a whole. That's the link I sent the guys to do the research. Harlan, would you like to tell her what piece you actually ended up reading because you didn't get the link?
Avoiding racism, race and representation in Austin-inspired games. That's what I read.
So I sent them a lighter piece to read, and man, Harlan dove right. He texted me. He's like, "This is intimidating. I had to look up what the Regency was." I'm like,
"Oh shit."
No clue about half of that stuff.
But so to take it back a little bit, would you please tell the stream a little bit more about what you do and what your work, kind of coming to the academic work that you're doing?
Sure. So first thing is, I'm kind of like the middle of a Venn diagram, right? So long time tabletop player, kind of all the way back to the 90s when we were in the rise of White Wolf. Dungeons and Dragons at that point was something that, my older cousins played in the back room and they didn't let us play, right? So I went to college and I thought I was going to like study Russian lit, and that didn't happen. And I stumbled my way into what's called the long 18th century, because 18th centuryists are like, what, 1700 to 1800? No. 1660, 1835. We're like on the expansion, right? And so I study the formation of the early novel and how audiences created that, and how, and I became really fascinated with, this idea that this is a genre that we all know now and we think of as like a way to, study in school, and they're big and they're thick, but they were the video games of the 18th century. People were afraid that their children were going to read them and like, get bad ideas, do things in private that they shouldn't, all this kind of stuff. And so along the way, I've become really interested in other genres that do a similar kind of work. And so when we got to the rise of actual play, starting with, at least in terms of streaming, right? Like the Acquisitions Incorporated kind of stuff, and that sort of thing, I became really interested in like, oh, wait, there's a new thing happening and nobody knows the rules. And so everybody's kind of figuring out the rules. And, a couple of years ago, right before the pandemic, I wrote a piece for an edited collection on Critical Role and narrative time. How do critters, even with just campaign 1, figure out how to consume it? And that kind of spiraled into a class on tabletop role-playing games that got really popular, and that led to people following me on Twitter and offering to come to visit my class. And now there's a book project in the works. So it's just kind of gotten bigger and bigger from there. So this fall, I'm teaching a graduate course on the 18th century as it's represented in games. So we can talk more about what the Regency is, that late 18th century moment that I like to call the Age of Revolutions. Alongside a undergraduate research seminar, which is going to look explicitly at actual play and what's going on there. Cool. I think that gives you an origin story and where we are right now.
It's really cool. I tell people when you were coming, I was like, this is one of the few people that I follow, because I got onto Twitter to promote the podcast, really, but you're one of the few people that I follow on Twitter to actually follow, because 1, the cool content that you put out, and 2, you also tweet out a lot about life as an academic, and have opened a pretty fascinating window, even from a professional standpoint, of what the publication cycle is like, what the class cycle is like, dealing with students, the challenges of being a woman in that space. There's so highly recommend you as a Twitter follow, just for, and of course all the other stuff that you do as well, because it really, you touch on some really just cool bases, which it's been a blast to see.
Yeah, it's super weird, by the way. This has been the kind of year where I hit that, they say for academic Twitter, because academic Twitter is, doesn't see the numbers that, other parts of Twitter do, right? So when we hit 5,000, we're like, oh shit. And I had a colleague who was fired for tweets about the football team before they even got here. I mean, he's also a prison abolitionist. So, the two things kind of, they got mad at him about the football, and then they found out that he was, against, the, everything to prison pipeline. And so, yeah. So I'm keenly aware that the more visible I get, I mean, I've got tenure, but you can still, it still make your life difficult. And of course, being a woman talking about games, that's fun. And of course, if you talk about Critical Role, that's a fun, messy place to be. So it's interesting. Like I've not intentionally grown my audience. It just kind of has happened a little bit organically, and hopefully it will stay a safe, sane place where people don't get mad at me for weird shit. But we'll see.
Yeah, that's been one of the cool things. And again, coming as from a place of privilege, jumping into the TTRPG space, how welcoming and general low tolerance for ass hattery there has been. Because look, I was scared of Twitter, but as I got into it, it's like, oh, here's my people. Okay, cool. But I can imagine, and you know, we ran into this with had this discussion with one of our collaborators on the side podcast that we're working on. It's like, yeah, as a woman in the gaming space, there's a whole other slew of BS that I have to deal with, and I'm like, yeah, I can imagine that can be pretty rough. And I don't Critical Role fandom, Star Wars fandom, like in the spectrum of potentially toxic fandoms, where do you put them on the spectrum?
Oh no, I think no. Star Wars is a totally different world. I mean, they've had decades to hone their craft, right? Like it's also just a bigger media space. It's going to be interesting to see as Critical Role fandom stops being about what one streamer who's involved with it, who talked to my class, called, you know, tantric viewing. Now there are other ways. There are other ways into Critical Role that don't involve like obsessively watching for 4 hours or more a week. So it's going to be interesting to see how that infusion of other kinds of fans will transform the space. It's definitely, there's a great book, really inexpensive. It's a crossover academic book. I'm not in it. I think it's great, called Watch Us Roll. It's like the first kind of truly about actual play book out of McFarland. And there's an article by the editor, Shelley Jones, that talks about the way that Critical Role fandom is aggressively self-censoring in a lot of ways. And sometimes, in some ways that's really good, right? Yeah. Like you want to make a positive space. You know, I just saw Jasmine, that bronze girl Bueller, going off on Twitch about how, yeah, no, you don't have to be in my space if you're not here for the community, right? Yeah. You know, so there's good parts to that kind of that work. But what it also means is like the fan information, like their wiki and stuff, is like, there's shit you don't talk about. There's information that's not there, which is really quite interesting, right? As an academic, you think, oh, the information needs to be there, but you know, there's stuff you don't talk about, and I mean, so it's interesting. I avoid a lot of it, and I don't know whether I just have really good filters or what, or I'm just not on Tumblr enough, where a lot of stuff goes to die. But yeah, it's you know, it's question marks. I'm either doing something right or I'm missing something. But no, I think on the whole, the core Critical Role fandom is pretty they're dedicated. They're lovely. Most of them are pretty lovely and productive. Right. It's a space that seems really invested because they've been rewarded in fan art and other kinds of creative responses. A lot of those folks then have become creators in interesting ways. I mean, but yeah, there's always going to be the toxic underbelly of everything.
Yeah, there is a certain ratio of ass hattery that you just can't escape in human beings, and it's unfortunate, but if you can get that ratio of X to Y just right, it's still a decent group of people to be around.
It's always a small group of those people, but it just seems like they are the loudest, and their Twitter fingers just go work a little faster than everybody else's because they just bubble to the top.
Yeah, well, and it's also, you know, it's horrible that the lava-like flow of the worst toxicity comes out when even mild critique is involved, right? And so the fact that the space is extremely radioactive, particularly for people who identify as fans of the show, who are SWANA or people of color, who are, you know, expressing, you know, mild concern about, say, you know, the new intro or what have you. That's troubling. That's the part where I get worried.
Yeah, and I know there was I'm not a big Critical Role guy. I have bounced off it.
I know. I know you bounced off it hard.
Yeah, I've tried to go back. I have watched the cartoon. I did manage to make it through the cartoon, and I've tried to listen. Have listened to, I think, the side quest that please say her name because I'm going to get it wrong again. It's Abria.
Abria Iyengar.
Thank you so much. I'm terrible at names. I apologize. Abria Iyengar. I actually managed to make it through the side quest bit that she DM'd because it just was one. I love anything that she does, and two, it was a little bit more compact. I think, and was
easier. They really so when I'm teaching this stuff, I have to figure out what's a good entry point for students who don't know anything. I have a few students, and I may have more as the kind of years and semesters go on, who are familiar with Critical Role in full. I had some straight on critters. Mm-hmm. So the fact that Abria came to class and Amy came to class was amazing. Yeah. But finding a way in, I think they also shine, and there's some really interesting innovations in their Call of Cthulhu one-shot when run by Talis and Jaffe. Mm-hmm. I think that's, and I think that quite frankly, among the innovative actual plays, in terms of content and exploring ideas, Liam O'Brien's 3-part Liam's Quest it'll fuck you up. It's the one. I have a colleague here who's the head of the theater department, and he's slowly getting into all of this because it's a fascinating performance space. And that's the thing we're gonna watch together as a kind of acting. It's a fascinating, and also just it's a voice acting bravura performance. All of Critical Role is, but that one's a particular. When the players are impressed, it's a good sign. But yeah, I think there's a lot of other, Geek and Sundry. There's going to be a history of Geek and Sundry someday, and what has come out of it. And Critical Role is one of those things. LA by Night is another one of those things. And then what the Hyper RPG folks are doing, what Zachlin Eubanks is doing with Kolak that just came back is just bonkers. There's a lot of amazing pathways forward in actual play. And that's one of the things I'm hoping to explore more in my research and in my teaching is where's the innovations that are really working with audiences? What's really satisfying?
Yeah, it's obviously it's a very crowded space right now. Lord knows we participate in it, but it is there seem to be certain boundaries where the actual hardcore plays, which to a certain extent, that's kind of what Critical Role is set up as, with the caveat of look, these are professionally trained voice actors and performers. And even though they structure their show as hey, this is just a full blown, a home game that's being televised, it's also heavily produced with professional voice actors versus there's that in the spectrum. And then there is our end, which is certainly not heavily produced, but definitely edited for time and clipped down a little bit more for flow more than anything else, to kind of cut out some of the, oh my God, Turner spends 3 minutes turning to page 45 of the player's handbook because
the real stuff of D&D, right? The real stuff of most games.
Right. Because Harland won't write down how far his jump distance is for the life of him. And I have to look
how jumping works.
He could have saved us so many times.
So much time.
One
so
formula.
And it's not even that complicated formula. It doesn't stick in my brain. As you look at the genre as a whole, do you see a trend more one direction or the other, or is it still pretty Wild West as far as the different genres and subgenres? And why isn't this its own genre on Apple Podcasts yet? Because Lord knows.
Oh, geez. Well, I wish, man. That made my life so much easier. It's been really interesting to kind of look at people who are doing kind of more of I'm a literary historian, right? I do qualitative research most of the time. I don't do quantitative. There are people who have done quantitative research in this space, taken actual plays and counted how they use time. And there's some really cool stuff, some really cool work that's there. But yeah, it's exploding rapidly. And that's one of the interesting things in terms of thinking about as a historian of this, right? And the history is still being written, kind of trying to decide, what do we want to remember? What are the key touchstones? And there are some things, there's a reason why there's a book on Critical Role that's being devised, right? That's being pitched, and that a bunch of us are writing chapters for. Because you can go to a publisher and say, these people got $11 million. They have hundreds of thousands of viewers. They have 1 million subs on Twitch now. What the fuck?
Yeah.
You can make that argument, right? You can make the argument for anything sponsored by WotC or by the game dev, by other like White Wolf or what have you. Chaosium, it's a little bit more Wild Westy.
Yeah.
But because they sponsor a bunch of stuff, but you can make an argument for those kinds of things, and then you can make arguments for the ones that like have whole studios, the hyper RPG shows, the stuff that came out of Geek and Sundry,
right?
But there's this whole there's this whole podcast realm where the barrier to entry is, do you have the time to edit? Do you have a good enough mic? And do you have people who jive, right? And do you have a story that your audience is willing to go with you for? And that's the long tail, right, of media.
Right.
It's, what B-Dave loved to tell my students, right? Like, all you need is 1,000 loyal fans to survive, right? And you build off of that. And if you can get that, you're good. I mean, I think that the recent podcast statistics were like, if you're getting a couple of hundred downloads in the first week, you're in the top 10% of podcasts. Now, a scholar like me doesn't fucking know. Right? Like, I can't be like, oh, please sort them by how many people downloaded them last week.
Right.
There's so much stuff behind walls that I can't know. So I can't use that as a metric. And then my own taste is suspect. I'm a white lady. What the fuck do I know? I mean, I can tell you what this one nice white lady from Texas who lives in Alabama likes, but my taste is, shaped by what I get to watch and view. There's only so much time. These things, even cut for time, are often an hour, 2 hours. I try to dip into as much as possible. I tweet constantly begging people to tell me about their shows. And tell me what's exciting about them and why I should go watch them, to kind of give everything an honest shot. But it's hard. And then there's this existing network. It's largely LA based. Gabe Hicks has talked about the East Coast move, but it ain't happened yet. And so you got this tangle, and I got to write a book explaining to people who aren't in this space why they should fucking care, what they should watch and how they should watch or listen with care and attention. And I am in constant terror that I'm missing out on something very big and exciting that that just hasn't come up in my algorithm, that hasn't come up in the discourse, that isn't getting the eyeballs it needs to. And this is what happened in the 18th century with novels, right? Explosion of media. Some things were bestsellers in their own day, and some of those were crap, and some of those were good. And then we have things that we're constantly recovering that are amazing and that are really cool and satisfying now, and we publish them again. But you can't tie it to one metric. So welcome to my problems. Welcome to my life.
So what you're saying is we really need to encourage the East Coast, West Coast actual play rivalry, very similar to 90s
don't we
hip-hop.
really need a new East Coast, West Coast rivalry? Not maybe without, no.
I'm just saying our podcast is based off of a Biggie song. So at least the title, very technically, which has absolutely nothing to do with the content, thanks to the cast. I wanted to make a terrible 90s drama reference, but they said no.
Honestly, there's a studio in Atlanta. I know ATL by Night is working. And if Gabe Hicks creates something in Philly, I will be there like little Spider-Man with my little notebook, just like taking notes. Right? I went to school outside of Philly. So give me an excuse, right? It'd be lovely to do that. As it is, I'm scheduled to go to LA in the fall for a conference where we're hoping to bring together people in this space to talk to each other, academics and people who are like on the production side, to talk about like, okay, how do we talk about this in a world where, the biggest players are all under NDAs, or don't want to talk about their process, or and that's where teaching has really come in and really kind of hyped up and like exploded my ability to work as a researcher, because they might not want to talk to me. I'm just a dumb professor, but but there is a certain number of people who are like, can I talk to students? I can talk to the next generation and tell them about stuff. This is amazing. Let me do that. And luckily, I have some former students who are also in this space, like London Carlisle came out of our theater program. He's now New York-based, another East Coast role player who runs games for Chaosium and is also like part of Satine Phoenix's network and that sort of deal.
And London will actually be bringing some of their cast members next month or the month after to come fight the Party of Five. So he's actually
shit! Good luck with that
on a future fight night. So yeah, we're punching above
we will
our
be
weight
there with
class
popcorn, man.
on a lot of levels. I forget which one of his, because he's got multiple shows. I forget which one he's bringing on for a fight night, but we're really stoked about that. And it's been so taking a step back from modern TTRPGs, because I do want to dip into some of your other work, because again, the breadth of the fascinating shit that you're into. Let's talk a little bit, because you tweeted about this the other day. You wrote a book about smell.
Yes.
Jamie actually did the homework and responded to your tweet, because I texted like, she's coming on this week. You guys better respond to this tweet and get your characters sent. So I didn't see if you responded to Jamie's Eldrin Thaneros.
That was the last one, and I have been in class ever since. So yeah, let me get my little database up. So talk to me about this character.
All right. So, Jamie, if you would, so for the stream who may not be following Dr. Friedman, and if you're not and haven't already, we will get the Twitter handle and everything out at the end. She basically said, "Hey, I'm going to bring back this deal where I ask you to describe the character, and then I will describe the appropriate perfume or scent for that character." Jamie, if you would please give your synopsis for Eldrin Thaneros.
Do you want me to read my tweet, or do you want me to just
dealer's choice, dude?
Okay.
Either one. You can riff. You got more than the characters. Go.
It's becoming a tradition for us to call you out for not talking to the guests every time.
Yes.
Eldrin is a Wood Elf Horizon Walker Ranger, and he is very critical of the rest of his teammates. He's always looking for something to criticize that they're doing wrong. He dresses in. He recently acquired a item that gives him a cloak made of denim, and he has a very 80s look going on. Yeah.
80s.
He's got like a mullet and 80s denim style cloak.
It's a braided belt of dwarven kind, which has given
this
him...
This took a turn, man. I thought I had an idea, and then what is even happening?
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, the denim definitely would seem to suggest kind of going into, the 80s vintage route in terms of perfumes, right?
Mm-hmm.
But fuck that. No, I reject. And so I find myself thinking about a perfume by a house called Zoologist, where all of them are like named after, and I can send you the link. Then they're all named after different animals, right?
Oh, cool.
And so this one is, I won't tell you that, I'll let you guess the animal that this is named after. It's eucalyptus, a kind of small sweet flower called a mimosa, black tea, incense, spices, with a kind of baseline of like green, rich vegetation, and then like the animalic musk, amber, and then some oak moss, although it's probably fake because oak moss is illegal. Is that sounding like a good vibe for your character?
I dig that.
Yeah, and I think it might fit with your character because it's called koala, which are like the bitchiest animals I know.
I like that.
That is appropriate.
That's very hits nail on the head.
Thank you.
so while we're at it, Todd the Tiefling's probably a little bit more traditional. Give her a little bit of a Todd synopsis if you could.
Well, Todd is a tiefling bounty hunter.
Okay.
He's a little conscious about his height, not too conscious about his height. He comes in at around a strong 5'8". he he
Swashbuckler rogue.
definitely swashbuckler rogue. He's got a little bravado to him. Thinks he's better than everyone else. Even so, constant in the back of his mind knows he's not there, but he doesn't give that outward portrayal. He portrays this big bravado, confidence kind of guy, but he's got some quirks about him. So
Okay.
that's usually him. In a
And,
nutshell.
and wears a lot of leather.
He's got some leather pants.
That's very important.
Yeah, I knew that one. I knew.
That is extremely important. So swashbuckler, as in like he's got his history of the sea. No. So you're swashing non-oceanic buckles. Okay.
Right. That is right.
Yes.
No. That works for me. Okay. So, let me think. And classic. Classic?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm thinking there's a very famous classic perfumer and named Alberto Morillas, who did everything from like the super ultra fresh like CK1 to some stuff from Bulgari that's like rich and like chai tea. And he does this kind of ghostly vetiver, and vetiver is a classic masculine scent.
Ooh.
So it's very green. You smell it a lot in men's cologne. And this one has like a little bit of whiskey, a little bit of papyrus, and a little bit of like smoky ash with the leather. It's called Mythique Vetiver by a house called Misencere. And I will hook you up with the link to where you can get a sample for. I love Lucky Scent. They're an indie place in LA that will send you a sample of basically anything they have. So just to kind of get a scent.
A smoky whiskey cologne sounds good. I would like to try that myself.
Yeah.
Awesome. And I mean, this is me like doing this much faster than I normally do. So
no.
Oh no,
Hey, look,
it sounds great.
So
I'll take it.
We appreciate you being game and firing from the hip.
Just to say that like if it's something that you vibe with after trying the scent and you're like, oh shit, that price tag is intense, I can also tell you about some other things that give that same feeling without being like cha-ching. That is also a thing that I do.
So Dr. Friedman isn't in the habit of sniffing your TTRPG players. She actually wrote a book called Reading Smell in 18th century fiction, which provides models for how to incorporate olfactory knowledge into new readings of the literary form central to our understandings of the 18th century and modernity in general. So again,
sounds so fancy, doesn't it?
It does. And I saw that
coming out in paper, finally coming out in paperback, which means that I can actually say, please go buy it. When it comes out in paper, it will stop being $100 and be like a good 30. And then it's great. I love it. It's my stupid little book that I meant to write an article. I have this habit, right? Like, I think I'm writing an article about Critical Role, and all of a sudden I have this whole new research program. I think I'm writing an article about smell, and it becomes a whole ass book. So this is the thing that sometimes happens, and I guess it happens a lot in my own research program. So there's a chapter on it's all the smells that transformed during the 18th century that like came into the kind of Anglophone British osmology, like their scent world, and twisted it upside down. So tobacco changes in this period because tobacco is a fairly recent import, and people stop snuffing it and they start smoking it. And so that changes, and people write about it. There's the smell of other people, because whenever two cultures come together, if we have documentation of both those cultures, we have them both going away, writing back home and saying, you will have no idea how bad these people smell. Like the English are like, the English meet the Japanese, and the Japanese are like, these people smell like rotten milk. What is wrong with them? I don't think they bathe. There's something really wrong here. These moments of cultural contact. And of course, these are still things like I just had a call a couple weeks ago with the LA Times, which was doing a piece on kind of I think it's a sriracha factory that like exploded or did something bonkers, right? And the scent went everywhere. And there's a long history in California of new industries coming in that are pungent, often being kind of led by new people to the area, and people freaking out, right? Like I remember from elementary school, talking shit about somebody's lunch, talking shit about what they smell like. This is something you have to be aware of, right? Yeah. That we use this as our smell is the only sense that we perceive, and our brain doesn't do the higher order discerning. It just reacts. It's our danger sense. Right. So when we smell something new and novel, we go on alert, and we have to kind of decide danger or not danger. And so we have human beings have used that in the past to do all kinds of horrible things. Yeah, we use it now to do all kinds of horrible things.
I was going to use it to badmouth Houston, but Mr. Bible Pants already beat me to it.
Mr. Bible Pants, sir, I am proudly from H-Town. Yeah. I went to elementary school with Miss Beyonce Knowles. You will take H-Town out of your mouth. No, sir. Not gonna happen.
We're only making fun of the way Lubbock smells on this particular.
She said she went.
I will accept Lubbock.
She said she went to school outside Philly, so she's probably been in New York. So you smelled the New Jersey Turnpike.
Oh, indeed. Yeah, my sister lived in various parts of New York and surrounding until they moved to DC fairly recently. So yeah. Exciting smells all over the place, right?
Hey, I grew up on a cattle ranch. Believe me, there's been a whole in Florida, no less. So there's a whole cornucopia of biological matter that I've been subjected to.
But it is true that paper mills are like the worst smells in the whole world. Like they are. I have a friend and colleague, Jonathan Sachane, who's written a history of paper and paper making and how that's contributed to culture and things like that. And yeah, I mean, paper making, the processing, I mean,
so is it the chemicals that smell?
Yeah, it's the process. Yeah. These days, it's definitely the process. I love to tell my students that like before the wood pulp, it was just everybody's used underwear because it was flax-based paper before wood pulp. And so ragmen would go around and get your linen shift and process it back down. So you insulted someone's writing by saying it was going to become toilet paper. Relics of the bum is the kind of 18th century poetic line that gets used.
Nice. Nice.
Yeah, no. My graduate school education outside of York, England, where Cadbury is, much more pleasant. The gentle whiff of chocolate.
Oh, there you go. Yeah,
that's better. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that the chat is incidentally full of people just talking about disgusting scents. This is not what I expected when I wrote this book. You think you're going to write a book about like pretty perfumes, and then you're like, oh, ammonia and tobacco and sulfur and BO. Yeah, this. I guess this is where we are.
I think it's one of the lines that has always stuck with me from The Sandman, where in the back half of the book, one of the characters is at a Renfest, and he's like, you know what they always get about these people get wrong about Renfest is nobody realized how much everything fucking stank back then, and how we were all covered in shit, pretty much.
Well, and that's the weird thing, right? Is like, so I get that a lot, right? Like the idea that like, oh, the past smelled worse. I'm like, no, the past smelled different.
Yeah.
Right. If we went back as time travelers, yeah, it would smell gross to us. But I often wonder, like, what the world would smell like to a time traveler who came forward. Because there are some scents that are not there. We have decent indoor plumbing that we didn't have even 100 years ago. Or I guess 150 years ago at this point. But the smell of air conditioning is a fairly new smell in our osmology. My grandparents like noticed it, right? That there's new stuff, right? And of course, like people have scent sensitivities now. Like I imagine I imagine an 18th century woman walking into Sephora and just keeling over and dying, right?
I can't walk
you
into those
know,
places without getting a massive headache.
Yeah,
no, it's true. It's true. And so one of the things that I try to say in my book is this idea that we can't judge the past based on our own noses, because the other thing that we know about smell is that it's deeply personal and culturally contingent. Like what smells good to you is not going to necessarily smell good to me, based on what we grew up with, the foods that we ate, the worlds that we've lived in. And that's not to say that my smell's good and your smell's bad, but that we are all, even those of us who are living in the same place at the same time, can be separated by how smells impact our brains. Mm-hmm. Remove 300 years and, all bets are off.
I mean, we can judge, we just shouldn't, is the
we can always,
and
we
frequently do, let's be clear. Like, we'll judge.
Very true, very true.
Can you talk about one of the things that's popped up on the cast a couple of times is that Jamie and Harland, as I learned to point at which pocket the right person is in. I'll learn the camera eventually. It's only our 500th stream. It went to school and took some classes with Dave Arneson from D&D Origins fame as part of Full. Can you talk a little bit about your class on D&D? And it's really more focused on the narrative aspect of it, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, so what's amazing about coming into this space as a comparative newbie, especially in terms of newbie to TTRPG studies, is as a scholar, you kind of want to find your niche. And there's not a whole lot of people who talk about what's called narratology, the study of how narratives are constructed. Jennifer Grueling is one of them, and she edited the book that I'm in for that Critical Role narrative timepiece that came out last year. But even now that we have actual play, the narrative levels that she describes, which are like, there's the narrative level of the GM talking, right? And telling you what's happening. There's the narrative level of the player in character talking about what they're doing. Right. There's the narrative level of asking for chips at the table, right? Like, or the group chat or what have you. And those are the levels that Jennifer Grueling outlines in her work. And then you get actual play, and all of a sudden people are watching you. Right. And so like the essay that I wrote for the Rambling talks, like the first thing it's talking about is this moment that has an emotional impact, because it's not about it's about what's called the table talk. This, past the chips level has risen to the level of, oh, this is the emotional impact. This is why, if you care about Critical Role, you care because it's happening in this level too, at least in that moment. And that's the thing that like the adaptation is going to have to can't translate because it's gone. Yep. There's going to be it's a give and take. And so, when I thought about like how I was going to responsibly teach something, I was like, okay, I'm going to teach what these other people have written, but the thing I know the most is how to talk about how stories are built, and to think about these objects as story making engines or actual play performances as narratives. So that's kind of been my beat for the class that I taught last fall. I'm going to add in that 18th century, like thinking about representation stuff when I work with graduate students this coming fall. And then the new version of the undergrad class is going to kind of do a deeper dive into actual play itself, thinking about the people. I have an undergraduate research assistant now who is a BFA in, she's a design specialist. So she and I are like watching Kolak and just like taking notes on the camera angles and the cinematography and the lighting, because they're trying all this stuff in a 17 by 17 room. Yeah. With 10 cameras and like, lights from Amazon. Right. And so, I'm also a theater historian and performance historian, so that also becomes part of what I feel comfortable talking about. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to be the person who like talks. Most TTRPG and actual play has been talking about fan culture, and I'm much more interested in craft. I'm much more interested in talking to creators about that ends up being a little bit about fan culture because everybody's like on one level a fan and on another level a creator, and you kind of move back and forth between those levels, including myself. But yeah, I find myself drifting more and more to kind of writing the kinds of pieces that I wrote for the Rambling, where it's like, I'm gonna closely read. I'm gonna talk to you about a performance. I'm gonna talk to you about how it was built and the craft involved, and talk a little less about, you know, the fan art and the cosplay and things like that, even though that's amazing. But there's a ton of people, and you can see them on CritRoleBib, who are doing that kind of work. Because it's easy to do, because if you don't have any access to anybody.
Right.
I'm kind of leveraging the access that I increasingly have as a member of the community too. I am the senior ranking Critical Role scholar. I'm the
Nice.
oldest person.
Nice.
I'm the oldest person in this game, basically, who's working explicitly on actual play, as opposed to other stuff.
We could say we've had the pioneering actual play scholar on our. We are taking your feather and sticking it in our hat too, right there.
No, if you want the pioneer, I think Robin Hope was the first person. Her master's thesis, Mercer read her fucking master's thesis during campaign 1.
Nice.
Yeah, she's the very first pioneer. That's the beautiful, also kind of revitalizing thing is, like, I work with so many what we call early career researchers, so graduate students and people who are recently out, and they're kind of the engine driving stuff forward. I would not be writing this book except for Maria Alberto, who's a graduate student working on canon formation, including a chapter on Critical Role, but also other kinds of canons, who was like, I think maybe you should like pitch a book to this thing. And that didn't work out. But then I contacted one of my colleagues who's doing a series for Bloomsbury. And I said, hey, I'm thinking about writing this kind of book. And he's like, oh, funny you should say that. I watched The Legend of Vox Machina, and now I'm watching Critical Role. And I'm an 18th and 19th centuryist, but you know, now I'm interested in what you have to say. And so maybe this book could happen. So we'll see. We're at the proposal stage. I do not know the rest of Maria's dissertation in progress. You can find her also on the tweets at let me look that up really quickly, at Maria K. Alberto. If you're looking to hear about her cool ass work, and she's also a co-founder of CritRoleBib.
Cool. There was Mr. Bible Pants asked this, and this may not be your wheelhouse, but as you look at as you're analyzing the stories as a whole, and he's asked this question twice, and he'll give me hell in the Discord if I don't bring it up. Do you see a higher percentage of characters that are orphans, and it's Walt Disney to blame for that?
I mean, Disney's to blame for so much. My colleague in the theater department is a Disney historian, so you know, much can be laid at the feet of Mr. Walt. You know, that's actually really an interesting research question, and I've actually been trying to collect research questions to have undergraduates start to look into. There we go. Is how many, you know, actual play characters have no families, that kind of thing. I'm inclined, because I think most D&D characters, if we were to survey the fandom, you know, hey, Watsy, call me. I'll help with your next survey. Because we didn't ask that question in the big long survey that just came out. Came out a while ago. But Liam O'Brien put it best when he was like, "Look, orphans have a reason to go somewhere else, right? Like I just finished a session 00 with my local party, which is all history professors and a theater professor and me." And we were building our party for Storm King's Thunder because our DM is a father who also is like my connection to Arneson. They were at the same friendly local game store 1 billion years ago because he grew up in the area. But he's the father of a young kid, and even we've been doing modules, you know, kind of prefab for a while, ever since his youngest kid was born, even though he's a homebrew guy. Primarily because they're easier to run. And we got him the Waterdeep Platinum box like 1 billion years ago, and he's so excited. And he's like, this is a city campaign. I need something linear. And I'm like, all right, I'll give you a month I'll run like Witchlight and get these jokers to have total chaos. And then you'll come in with this linear campaign about, giants, and it'll be great. So we did session 00, and my friend and I kind of decided, we were like, can we please be furbolgs? Because this is a guy who does not allow tieflings at his table.
Really?
He's a very kind of like, he's super like, what would actually happen in the Forgotten Realms.
Right.
Which is really weird because my Waterdeep character, because we played a few sessions in Waterdeep before he lost it, was a gnome artificer, and he's like, oh, so you're going to have a gun. And I'm like, I'm going to have a gun. He's like, oh yeah, no, I can find, here's the explanation, of how that works in the Forgotten Realms. Like, oh, I did not know, like, I do not associate you with this kind of, choice. But so we got Furbolgs, and so we have this Furbolg little duo. I am doing a total pacifist run because somebody had to be cleric, and it's my turn.
Cool.
But my dearest friend, theater professor, wanted to have a gritty backstory because theater. And so he's basically Furbolg Ranger Batman, as far as I can tell, which meant that it went from me thinking, oh, our clan sent us out in the world on a fact-finding mission about giants, to no, you were sent on that, you came home, and your clan is decimated. Like, okay, great, super awesome, yeah. But yeah, so it's wild to do this kind of collaborative work together, because you never know what's going to happen.
Well, and I think that actually Saganato asked if you read X-Men at all, and I think that ties into a little bit of the scene setting. I guess a lot of people's cultural context for adventurer type characters are superheroes, and there is no deadlier position to be in than to be a budding superhero's mother, father, uncle, or near relative, because they all get bumped off somewhere on a long enough timeline.
Yeah, in a world where we didn't have women in refrigerators, maybe that wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
But we're not there yet. So here we are. But yeah, I mean, I definitely love when a character choice includes this kind of rich background,
right?
Of human connection. And so when I run my 18th century D&D campaign, it started as kind of a joke, where I said, anybody who wants to play D&D at the American Society for 18th Century Studies conference, the like national nerd conference for 18th century scholars.
Nice.
Like the only rule, I was like, anybody can come. The only rule is it has to be either a fictional or real life 18th century person.
Right.
That you and I'll help you build the mechanics for, what this Jane Austen character or what Jane Austen herself would be like in this kind of timey-wimey, sort of setting. And our bad guy was was William Beckford, who was secretly an incubus, which seemed appropriate. William Beckford wrote this kind of amazing Orientalist novel, Vatek. And by amazing, I mean it's astonishingly bizarre. It's not necessarily good, but it's fascinating. And he was able to write trippy things and build trippy things because he was the beneficiary of sugar plantation money. So he was basically like, the blood was directly on his hands. That was very satisfying to everyone involved. But that was that initial table was 17 people.
Good Lord. And you're solo DMing that.
Yep. I don't claim to have done it especially well. I have a thing on my YouTube channel where I walk through. What I did was this guy, Horace Walpole, who was the author of the first Gothic novel, his house, which is like this, it's built in the 18th century, but it's a throwback to like medieval art. And he collected a bunch of stuff, and he had his own printing press. He's a very weird guy in that 18th century way. And he was their quest giver. And his house still exists, and there are great photos because it's been recently restored, Strawberry Hill House. And there's a map overlay with where all the stuff was and all the stuff survives. at the Lewis Walpole Library at Yale, and they photographed it, and like, so they've made this like interactive map where you can kind of click through the rooms and like see the stuff. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to turn every single one of these things into a magic item, or something to attack them, right? Like, so you got talking paintings, you've got, you know, the little dog statue became a blink dog that's their new buddy, you know, all these kinds of things. And so it was an experience, right? Yeah. 17 people, mostly newbies. It's dialed down to 6 people, and ever since we played once a year for a couple of years, and now with the pandemic, we play every other week, and we do awesome stuff. And I re-skin modules to have kind of 18th century, like mostly independent stuff from the DMs Guild and stuff like that, to have 18th century flavor. But all of these people are real and have all kinds of, you know, family continuities and connections that you can kind of play with and exploit, for sure.
So because again, this is another one of the topics I want to get to, and you transitioned so artfully into it. So quantify a little bit of exactly what 18th century flavor would be for the chat. I know, man, sure. I know that's uncorking the cork on a alchemy jug. Just dumb it down for us. Sure. Here's where we ask you to dumb it down a bit.
Oh no, absolutely. So with 18th century flavor, it actually ends up being, so for the first setting, for the first like adventure that I created, it was very much about making it about exploring this place, exploring this house, and having the flavor come from the items, right? Okay. So I could hand out the picture of the item, or describe it in a way, because I'm, you know, I've got this audience that is very familiar with a lot of these things. As time has gone on, the flavor has come from 18th century characters confronting the kind of shit a D&D adventurer. So my favorite player, Professor Alice Villaseñor, she's a Jane Austen scholar. So she decided to roll up a character based on Jane Fairfax, who's this minor character from Jane Austen's Emma. She's the good girl in Jane Austen's Emma, but who does one naughty thing, right? And it's not actually that naughty, but this is the character that she's built, right? And this woman, when confronted with gnolls for the first time, healed them in the middle of combat and almost died. And it was a really interesting moment that we kind of talked about later, you know, because, you know, one kind of DM would have said, okay, and now you're going to die because D&D doesn't work that way. But that feels like the straight road to, you know, Reddit, to being featured on a subreddit somewhere as like the total asshole. And so we talked a little bit more about like, okay, so what is her character? What's the reasonable things her character can do? You know, how do I represent to this totally naive character that gnolls are gonna fuck you up, right? That there is no negotiating with a gnoll, right? It's an interesting challenge, right? Of this defamiliarization by having these people who don't have a medieval mindset or a fantasy mindset. They have this like world of manners mindset, right? You know, they have this world of, you know, when you're confronting people, you know, in theory, I'm sure someone is going to tell me somewhere at some point, well, why aren't you fucking running Good Society? Good Society's great. Love Good Society. It's the Jane Austen RPG. Hearts all over the place. But I actually like what it's like to experience, you know, this, you know, the worlds built by D&D through this kind of unfamiliar lens of these, you know, saucy actresses and, you know, prim and proper, you know, middle class, you know, gently reared ladies. It's kind of fun.
And that's something I think 5th edition has done really well and lends itself to really. Like, I know there's a lot of critiques about kind of the binary pass fail setup with the D20 system, but, you know, we went the opposite direction and brought it completely contemporary and then added an unhealthy amount of dick jokes. So the opposite of the Age of Manners. But
no. Dick jokes. Oh no. Please let me not dissuade you. Dick jokes are in Jane Austen. And dick jokes are the part and parcel of the 18th century. If you're not calling somebody a dick or drawing dildos with wings, you're not in the 18th century I know about. So, no.
They transcend time. I bet there's cave walls with those on there.
No, for real. The Victorians have much to explain in terms of their whitewashing, their rejection of their own sexuality that was very clearly happening at the same time, but also their kind of scrubbing of the past. Yeah. Part of my job is constantly to say, like, the 18th century was dirty and bitchy and mean and, very much like our own time in a lot of ways. Instead of yelling at people on Twitter, you yelled at them in the coffee shop or made fun of them, what was called illegitimate theater, the stuff that wasn't happening on the main stage kind of deal.
Doctor, you have ruffled our petticoats. Is Doctor?
Yeah, I mean, it's like this. Mr. Bible Pants is absolutely this kind of chain reaction of the Edwardians creating the prudery of the Victorians, but the Victorians, I assure you, like, put in their fair share of kind of judging stuff and making selections about what was acceptable to remember and what wasn't from the 18th century. Jane Austen was not the only woman writer. She wasn't even the first woman writer, but there were a whole bunch of women writers who were saying men ain't shit, right? Marriage, fuck marriage. There's no men going there. All the men are dead. So let's figure out something else, but that's not the stuff that got republished and preserved and thought about because it was, not in the benefit of the empire, right? That's being formed in the late 18th and into the 19th century.
Yeah, and I think 5e gives you the flexibility to kind of play with setting with that, and I think that's their push going forward too. With Mordenkainen's Monsters of the Multiverse. I said it. I just wanted to try where they're trying to get more. Not a generic system, but to focus more on kind of different world book scenarios in different settings. So there's your opportunity right there. There's your speaking of getting involved with WotC, you could be the 18th century source book author. I want to see it.
Oh man, and it's so weird, right? Like, we've had so much conversation on Twitter in the last, basically it's a cycle, right? Of, we will never be rid of D&D, and we will never be rid of people talking about how we will never be rid of D&D. Those are the two constants in our world. And it's tricky. I mean, I tried to, when I first taught the TTRPG class, I really desperately wanted to avoid, for at least part of the semester, talking about D&D. Some of my students already were familiar, and it's a pretty fucking crunchy system to introduce to the sweet English ed majors who were taking this as their diversity requirement. Ooh. I have questions about that, but that's beside the point. But I'm sitting next to a stack of tabletop role-playing scholarship and video game scholarship, and it all assumes D&D. And so now I have to do some serious thinking. And same deal with when I pitched the thing for Post45 was, first line of the pitch was, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons and Critical Role are going to sell people, are going to get people in the door, are going to get students to enroll in my class. But on the other hand, I don't want to give them all the space, right? And that's really tricky. Like, I love D&D. I clearly have been talking about all the D&D that I play and that I do, but they don't need my hype. They don't even need my consulting. There's all, and so when I do and luckily, when we talk about 18th century games and who's doing 18th century flavored games, it's the indie circuit. Yeah. Right. It's Story Brewers has kind of put a mark on that, but also a lot of people who are doing like Age of Sail stuff. It's Zweihander has Flames of Freedom, which we're going to look at ASEX. There's a lot of opportunities, in terms of that representation that I kind of want to foster. And that's kind of, now that I have 2 classes in the fall, I can kind of say, the grad class is going to be where we talk indie stuff, and maybe we don't have to talk about D&D because we can't. And we'll talk about Vampire because Vampire does have 18th century source books. And then we'll almost assuredly talk about D&D because you can't talk about actual play without talking about D&D. You really can't. I do have, there's an essay that I've commissioned for this Post45 collection. I'm not sure that I buy the argument. I wanted to give space to an argument that I wasn't sure that I agreed with because I haven't read the piece yet, just the pitch, that basically argues that D&D is the worst mechanic for actual play, that there are better options. So I'm like, okay, show me an argument. I'm curious enough to see more. But it's tricky, right? But D&D's got the market share, and so I can completely understand why folks, hitch their wagon there. Although I guess the hyper people have said, and some other folks have said, their numbers are the same no matter what they play.
Right.
So who knows?
I think there's an interesting way to look at it because ultimately, and I think this is where a lot of actual plays can stumble out of the gate it is a performance. It's a different type of improv or a different type of play with a level of rules or engagement. And sure, which dice I'm rolling may not matter. I can see somebody forwarding the argument that like a World of Darkness, like a Vampire, because B Dave did this very specifically when he came on and said, hey, look, the dice pool system and a system that encodes partial successes into it allows for a broader narrative standpoint when you're sitting down to do the performance. But ultimately that comes down to the players and the DM and the kind of the dynamic that chemistry at the table. And I think no matter how great the system is, if you don't have a good cast chemistry, and that doesn't have to be positive, our cast hates each other, or you can't have one really be successful without the other. I think
it's interesting to think about mechanics as kind of, and how they relate to story once you're talking about performance, right? And B Dave's right. I mean, I know he said this many times, right? Like, it's what do you want to accomplish, right? With whatever you're doing. And it's been really interesting in the run up to Hyper's return of Kolak Live. I was watching their kind of play testing of Kids on Bikes, and they refined that system and actually threw some stuff out and adjusted it in order to make it work for that stream. And it's all documented on YouTube. So for me, it's like, yes, I can write about this because I can see all the places that they fucked up. And is that a technical term? Because most people, edit that shit out or don't release it or, or whatever. I think D&D mechanically works if what you want to do is participate in basically, it's not Adventurers League, but it is league play. It is, in a sense, what you assume the audience is coming in for, unless you're doing something like Invitation to Party, where it's like, we're going to teach you D&D along the way. Yeah. And Adventure Zone did this with Balance, right? Like, we're watching these chuckle fucks figure it out as they play. Yep. But now, 5 or more years on, we got that. Right. So now we have people who are very good at this kind of play, who are skilled and innovative in this kind of play. And so it's no longer this kind of necessarily parasocial, let's watch this newbie figure this shit out. It's watching someone who really knows how to marry narrative and character and clutch moves together. Sometimes in an optimized build and sometimes in a shitty ass build, right? Sometimes it's a cloak of billowing for flavor, which incidentally, I also had a magic tattoo that was my magic item, and then everyone else had magic tattoos. I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah. What's the dumbest thing I can choose from the list of things the students recommended? Cloak of billowing it is. But those are all kind of choices that you can assess and think about. And so what's fascinating to me is the ways in which D&D also allows for a kind of, I'm in the land of football, right? So in a kind of football adjacent kind of, you can think about stats, you can think about play-by-plays, we can think about Twitch clips as like the kind of instant replay, but it's narrativized. Right. We narrativize football and basketball and things like that too. My brother's a former sportscaster, and I feel now that I do this kind of work and I live tweet some streams and things like that, I think, yes, I understand my brother's when he was working as a sportscaster far more than I ever did, when he was actually doing it. Because I think there's that element. And that's going to be a core and growing audience.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the kind of artistic innovation of we're going to find something to tell a good story with. I wish more people were picking up Paranoia to run some more streams. It was hot for a while. I need more people, fucking each other over and dying many times. Can we have that back, please and thank you? And we're seeing, actually, now that I think about it, we're seeing that a little bit with D&D battle royales, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've had the Battle for Beyond with that Jasmine Bueller ran. There's been, Critical Role has a long history of doing internal battle royales when they hit milestone levels.
We're doing one.
You guys are doing a battle royale in London. Yes.
Yeah.
And there's something, I'm really fascinated by the fact that we're seeing this kind of little mini trend spike of that, because it satisfies all the things that we want. It's short.
Yep.
It's active. And you can dip in and out, and you can make it character rich, or you can just have people just wailing the shit out of each other with whatever cool shit they have on hand.
It's one of the things we actually started. So we hosted a PvP tournament at the end of last year to support Game to Grow. And so many of the 4 or 5 different podcasts participated, and they were like, this was a huge blast. We don't normally get to do this because, especially in the actual play in the performative space, you don't get to beat up on each other a whole lot. And so going, hey, come over to our podcast, kick our ass. And I say that because our guys lost every match they participated in the charity tournament we hosted.
It was for charity.
I will absolutely be on that kind of live stream. I have not played a level 20 druid, and I really want to.
We will go grab 2 other academics. We will get you on the schedule for a level 20 round.
Yes.
We'll bring it in. We'll do fight nights, the dumb kids versus the smart kids.
Two of my gaming group. So I have the D&D groups. I have an experimental Sunday brunch group, and then I have my Wednesday group, and they're in the chat. So Soren and Emily, just so we're all clear, we're doing this, right?
And I will come on before the end of the year. Get you do a fight night with us, and then come back at the end of the year to participate in Gimme the Belt for Game to Grow, because the winning team from that tournament takes home their very own championship WWE belt. Tabletop Titties won last year. I just sent that belt up to Canada.
Oh no, does that mean we have to have a cool name? Oh shit, I guess it's 18th century dick jokes.
Yeah, there you go. You've got to come up with these. So gang, we're coming up on time. So any last minute questions that I won't ignore, because I know keeping track of the chat and then actually talk, and then from the panel, Harlan, before we go to the chat, because God knows those kids, they're all hopped up on sugar and spite at this point. So Harlan, any questions for the guest?
So I was reading your the summary on your reading smells, and you have scent is one of our strongest ties to memory. Yet to remember smell without external stimuli is almost impossible for most people. What smell brings back your fondest memories?
So my favorite smell, and the smell I have the most fond associations with, is the smell of rising bread dough. And my graduate students will tell you that that is a smell that they associate with me, because I wear a perfume when I'm teaching called Eau de Peau, that is inspired by the scent of bread. There's also a perfume that was put out as a joke for London Fashion Week called Toast, under the joke that models don't eat carbs so they can smell like them. And a friend of mine in the UK, Elaine Ricker, won it and sent me this huge bottle of the smell of burnt toast. So I've got the bread, the Cantrip candles. By the way, their bakery smell is the only thing that has gotten close in terms of scented objects to that Proustian Madeleine like nostalgia smell. It is what this room smells like. So highly recommend.
Jamie, you got any questions for the guest?
I guess I was also going to ask about smell and how important is it to use like something familiar to set the scene for your players when you're setting up a scene for as a DM or something like that.
That's amazing, right? Like, because it's not been until the pandemic that I've really thought about scenting space. And of course, it's the one thing I can't do right now. So because my local table, we've gone back and forth as kind of, we're in Alabama, so what pandemic, which means that we all have to be super, super, super careful. But yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting because I've been slowly kind of collecting those kind of atmospheric kind of smells that can kind of pop in and pop out very quickly, which is a little tricky. Smell-o-vision was a disaster for a lot of reasons. But I like the idea of like, having a kind of low level kind of scent that, sets the stage, that gives you a feeling. And that can be something like an atmospheric candle, but it could also be something like the food that you eat, right? In the lead up to, when you're actually playing. Cause I don't know about you, but like it takes an hour for my local parties, well, any of my tables to actually get started talking, right? And playing the game. So, I think I think it's an as yet not fully explored aspect of gameplay that I'm hoping, we've had D&D has Heroes Feast, their cookbook and that kind of thing. So, I think we could be on the way.
Hey, we highly recommend Mystic Libations. We are from Todd Stashwick. That's his book cocktail book / adventure module / setting. Highly recommended. And then the drink I had on the Cantrip Sipper, which is an oat milk cinnamon cocktail garnished with a pat of butter when you serve it hot, I know it sounds horrific, but was incredibly delicious and made the entire little box I record in smell incredible for the entire show. So it was like, man, there was just this buttery, spicy richness the entire time. And it lingered. It more than anything wants me to come back to the cocktail. Yeah. I forget I don't know if it was Dimensions 20 Adventure Academy that they were doing for a little bit, but there was some other kind of bigger scale DM that came on and said, look, print out a sheet of paper with the 5 senses on it, and whenever you're setting a scene, obviously you're going to use sight, but pick one of those other 4 senses and hit on that, and then the next scene you describe, you're not allowed to repeat on that secondary one. And ever since I've started doing that, I've been at least every 3rd scene I'm gonna be describing the scent of the space that the characters are in, and found myself describing what I imagined a lava in a cave smelled like last night for my networking group. And it's like, okay, it really does, once you work that into a narrative requirement for setting your scenes, it really does make you think about it. Just it bleeds into kind of an enriching description in other areas. So it's
for sure.
It's had a really
and I
cool
love
time.
the systems, and I love the kind of, there are a growing number of games and adventure modules and things like that actually give you some of that language, which is very, very cool.
Well, cool, gang. We're going to wrap it up. Any last minute questions for the chat? Let me see. What smell does Jamie smell the most? And why is it clean laundry that sits in the hamper for weeks?
What I love about your community is the positivity and the...
Oh, we're all horrible people, and we really appreciate you coming on.
We feed off each other.
The backstory to that, because there is one, is we do have a patron goal that Jamie will agree to dress up as Tingle from Legend of Zelda and fold laundry on stream for an hour. So that's why laundry apparently is a running topic, not just because he has a snuggle bear fetish. Let's see if there's any other questions I missed from the chat, especially here. The guest, are you sure? No, I think that's it. So okay, gang, we're gonna wrap it up because Dr. Friedman has been more than generous with her time. First of all, thank you so much for coming on. You're an incredibly fascinating person. We really appreciate the time that you've had. I can't wait to get this back out into the podcast feed as well, which will happen in a couple of weeks. So we'll be sure to give you a shout out on that when that promotes. Will you tell everybody where they can find your work and the stuff that you're doing?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter all the days because that's how I talk to people these days. At Fried, that's Fried E. And you can find my work at ecfriedman.com. The nice thing about academics is we're not making any money off of our work. So if you want a free copy of something, you can just email us. And we try to put the stuff that we publish in kind of open access repositories. We want our work to be read. We want people to hopefully vibe with what we're doing. And you can catch me, I guess, later on this year. I'll be on Secret Nerd. So
Awesome.
Yeah. So and some other. There's a Smelly Jane Austen podcast coming soon. So you can find out more about when that drops from my Twitter.
And potentially a fight night later this year. We'll talk.
Yes, please.
So, hey,
yes.
So because I can't ever forget, since Jamie reminded me that I forgot the questions a couple of times. And since our tradition is if you don't show up for the stream, you get at least a little bit of shade thrown at you. Harland, which Party of Five character do you think smells the worst? And what do you think that smell is other than Todd the Tiefling? And can't be Eldrin because he's here.
Yeah, I don't like the smell of cats, so I'm gonna have to go with Baba.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Jamie, same question. Which of your teammates do you think smells the worst? And not Todd, although we've thoroughly explored the leather pants situation in the swamp. So
as terrible as Todd probably does smell.
It's a little misty down there.
As terrible as Todd probably does smell, I think Moyle smells like old weed and just debauchery.
I'm pretty sure he's washing his hands in bong water more than a couple of times. So, all right. Well, he used to be until he was reborn as a Warforged. So, on that note, gang, thank you so much for joining us. We absolutely appreciate it. Again, Dr. Friedman, thank you so much for lowering yourself to our level on both intellectually, socially, and culturally. And once again, everybody, hope you enjoyed the show. Make the stream end, please.